You're listening to the Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus of the Lotri Foundation. In this podcast, Shaykh Zahir explains the aphorisms from Ibn Ata'Allah's famous book of wisdoms, Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyah, a classical manual of spiritual development. Visit seekershub.org for online courses, our reliable answer service, and engaging media.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما بفضلك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Ameen. So we're reached in this text, Shaykh Ibn Ata'Allah rahmatullahi alayhi, talking about the one's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how to improve it, how to move forward to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to gain closeness to one's Lord. This is he does it in terms of statements, hikmah, wisdoms that he says. So he says, and we'll explain inshallah. He says, قال رحمه الله تعالى ورضي عنه. He says, أصل كل معصية وغفلة وشهوة الرضا عن النفس. So he says the source of every disobedience and every heedlessness, the source of every sin, every disobedience, and every heedlessness, meaning that you're not conscious of Allah, and every shahwatin, and every desire is being pleased with the self, is rida'an in nafs, is being pleased with the self. Wal aslu kulli ta'atin wa aslu kulli ta'atin wa yaqadatin wa iffatin adam al-rida minka anha. And he says the source of every obedience and every awareness, yaqadatin, and so the source of every obedience and every awareness and every self-respect is not being pleased with it. Is you not being pleased with it. You're not being pleased with the self. And then he says, وَلِأَن تَصْحَبَ جَاهِلًا لَا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ أَن تَصْحَبَ عَلِيمًا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. So he says, to keep the company of someone who doesn't know, an ignoramus, who is not pleased with himself, to keep the company of someone who does not know, an ignorant person, who is not pleased with himself, is better for you than to keep the company of a scholar who is pleased with himself. فَأَيُّ عِلْمٍ لِعَالِمٍ يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. So what knowledge does the scholar possess if he's pleased with himself? What knowledge, what true knowledge does the scholar possess if he's pleased with himself? وَأَيُّ جَهْلٍ لِجَاهِلٍ لَا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. And what ignorance does the person who doesn't know possess? What ignorance does he have, and what ignorance does he have who is not pleased with himself? Who's not pleased with himself? If we break down the hikmah, what do we see? He's talking about the first two. He says that the source of every masiyah, of every disobedience, every heedlessness, every shahwa, every desire that one has, the source of it is being pleased with the self, rida'an in nafs, is being pleased with the self. What happens when one is pleased with the self? When one is pleased with the self, one then is covered, one covers up one's own flaws and one's own faults. When one is pleased with oneself, one does not see the blemishes that lie within the self. One does not see the blemishes that lie within the self. And one is concealed from seeing one's own flaws, and so one does not work on them. One does not work on them. One does not work on those traits that are within one, because one thinks that they're fine, that they're okay, and they become pleased with themselves. There's a reason for, and what happens when one is pleased, when one does not see one's flaws, one does not see one's faults and so on. What happens? What happens is that the awareness and the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the dread of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does it do? It leaves from oneself. And those flaws and those traits, they will get stronger. They will get stronger. And those flaws and those traits, those faults that lie within one will become strong and attached, so that it pulls the person from consciousness. So they become heedless. And if they're heedless, you're more susceptible into falling into a sin, to masiyah. And those flaws and those traits hidden with that are within one, that one does not see, one does not work on, because one is pleased, meaning that one does not see it or realize it or take it to be significant, that it draws you out from seeing and distinguishing between what one should do and what one should not do. Even the distinction of a want to a desire or a need to a desire. So one may act on a desire because of a trait that's hidden in one, because of a trait that is hidden in one. And so this is what happens to a person who is pleased with themselves. How does one become pleased with oneself? How does it happen? And we have to be aware of how it happens, so that we do not fall into the category of being pleased with oneself. How does it happen? And this is probably the most important thing, is to understand how it happens. Because how it happens means that then we can prevent it from happening. One of the ways that it happens to be pleased with oneself is to look at others critically. When you look at other people critically and you start seeing flaws in other people, it helps, you ignore, the shaitan will enable you to ignore your own faults. And you will think that you're better than others. And when you think that, that means that you're pleased with yourself. So if you are critical of others and you look at other people, they're not doing this, they're not doing that, they're late for this, they don't pray here, they don't do this, they don't read this, they don't look like this, they don't have this. When you are critical of people, or that person fell into this, that person said this, that person did this, I saw this person do this. When you are critical of people, what does it essentially do? It draws you away from the sphere of looking at yourself and your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're taken away from yourself. You're taken away from the concentration of yourself. The concentration of yourself. And so even in being critical to your own ibadah, your own worship, you're not critical of it. You're not critical of it. You're critical of other people's ibadah. You're critical of other people's salah. You're critical of other people's recitation. You're critical of other things. And you don't look at yourself. And you don't look at the self. That is one of the areas that bring people into what? It brings people into being pleased with the self. And then the blaming of others. The blaming of others. And the other reason why that one becomes pleased with oneself, is that one looks at people who are, people who are lesser than one, but not in the way that one becomes thankful. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he said to us in a hadith, he says, look at people who are below you. And don't look, وَلَا يَنْظُرْ إِلَى مَنْ فَوْقَكُمْ. Do not look at those who are above you. Look at those who are lower than you. Why does he say that? Not so that you become pleased, no. So that you recognize that you have blessings and you're thankful for it. That you recognize that you have blessing and you are thankful. You become thankful for it. This is looking at people lower than you with the eyes of compassion and the eyes of empathy. You look at people through the eyes of compassion and who are lower than you. And don't look at the people who are above you. Because then you're going to try to compete. And you're going to see what they have, and you're not going to recognize that what you have is sufficient or from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you will compete with them. And you will say, I wish I had that, I wish I had that, I want this, I want that. And it leads to desires. And a non-recognition of being satisfied with what you actually have. This is satisfaction with Allah of what He places you, not with the self. Satisfaction with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of what He has given to you. So you enter into the door of shukr when you look at those who are less than you. If you don't look at people who are less than you with the eyes of compassion and empathy, then it turns into critiquing them. Then it goes into criticizing them. Then it goes into disparaging of them. Then it goes into hating them. And what does it lead to? Arrogance and pride. And it leads to being pleased with the self. And when you're pleased with yourself, what happens? When someone is pleased with themselves, they don't see that they need to be corrected. And they won't take correction. And they won't ask, because their egos does not allow them to ask. Because to ask someone a question, to know something, is as if they're admitting that they don't know something. And so they won't. So there's characteristics of people who are pleased with themselves. There are lots. Unfortunately, there's lots of characteristics of people who are pleased with themselves, and the outcome of it. The outcome of those who are pleased with themselves. The opposite are the ones who are not pleased with themselves. Meaning what? Meaning they're not they're not satisfied with the actions that they put forth to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're always trying to improve themselves. Not being pleased with the self means that it's a fuel that fuels you to get stronger, better, more quality in your ibadah, in your worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It fuels you. Not being pleased with the self, what does it do? That you blame the self. That what type of salah did I just pray? What type of recitation did I just recite? Why didn't I get up in the morning? So you blame the self. It powers you to try harder to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not being pleased with the self means that you're not pleased with the condition that you are in. Spiritually. You're not pleased with the condition that you are in relationship to your Lord. Not being pleased with the self is not being pleased with the condition of your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you want more. But you're not blaming Allah, you're blaming yourself. You're not blaming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is key, is that you're blaming yourself. And so what happens to those who are the source? There is a source of every obedience and every awareness. The source of every obedience, every awareness, and every self-respect. Meaning that that you have purity, and that you realize that the self is what is broken, yourself, and you realize that the flaws come from you. This is awareness and self-respect, that you know that the flaws come from you. It's not coming from someone else. You don't blame someone else, that it comes from you. This is the source, and this source of obedience and awareness and so on comes from what? Not being pleased with the self. Not being pleased with the self. This is the source of it. It's not being pleased with the self, not being pleased with where your relationship is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and wanting more. Wanting your salah to be more concentrated or more present of heart with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in it, and wanting your to feel more conscious with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what does it drive? What does it drive? It drives sometimes more ibadah. It drives more consciousness in your works that you're already doing. It drives this. And it drives being the fuel, this being not being pleased with the self. What does it fuel? I mean, it fuels that you are a good person to be around. That's what it fuels. Because when you're not critical of others, but you're critical of the self, then you're willing to learn. You're willing to learn. And when you're willing to learn, then you're willing to listen. You're willing to listen. And if you're around people that are listening and don't speak much, then those types of people get along with everyone. And the people who are just waiting their turn to speak and only want to speak and don't want to listen, those are the ones who people don't like to be around. Because in silence, people can learn. In silence, people can learn. And so Ibn Ata'illah, Shaykh Ibn Ata'illah, rahmatullahi, he equates it to then suhbah, to companionship. He equates it to companionship, and he equates it on two different spectrum. He equates it to the spectrum of scholars, the alim, and the other end of the spectrum is the ignorant person, the jahil. The jahil. And the period before Islam was called the age of jahiliyah, the age of ignorance. It was called the age of ignorance. Why? Why was it the age of ignorance? Because they were idolaters. They didn't believe in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They didn't have consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so they did horrible things. They did horrible things. They didn't have that belief to guide them. That's jahiliyah, that's jahl, that's ignorance. Ultimate ignorance is the ignorance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is ignorance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Ibn Ata'illah, that's what he said. It's not ignorance of not knowing something. I don't know, how to plant seeds. So what? That's okay. Get someone who can. I don't know how to build buildings. Okay, get someone who can. That's not what he's talking about, ignorance and alim. This is in terms of who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your viewpoint of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, to keep the company of a person who does not know an ignoramus is better, who is not pleased with himself. Keeping the company of who is not pleased with himself is better than keeping the company of a scholar who is pleased with himself. Why? Because that person who is ignorant, that person who does not know, if he's not pleased with himself, he's willing to listen and he's willing to get better. He's willing to get better. Because he knows his flaws and his faults. He knows his flaws and he knows his faults. And he's not going to demonstrate things and say things that he doesn't know. He's not. He's going to admit. The ignorant person who is not pleased with himself will admit to the things that he does not know, and he will ask. He will ask. He will ask. He will ask. And he's probably humble. Even though he's ignorant, he's humble because he's not pleased with himself. And he'll work on himself. As opposed to the alim, to the scholar who is pleased with himself. Meaning what? That he does. What is the alim that is pleased with himself? He can't take a challenge. He won't take critiques. He's too prideful. He won't accept differences. He won't accept differences. He won't accept people coming. He'll probably not smile a lot because he thinks everyone is below him. This is the alim who's pleased with himself. This is the alim who's pleased with himself. He won't take a challenge from someone. He won't take a critique. He won't know how to challenge it, or channel it. This is the alim who's pleased with himself. So what do you learn from a person who's like that? Nothing. Because Ibn Atiyah talks about something very, very important. He talks about something what is very, very important. When he says, so what ignorance does someone who is not pleased with himself have? What ignorance of Allah does an ignoramus have who is not pleased with himself? What ignorance does he have? Because ignorance there's two types. There's simple and there's compounded. Jahl basit, jahl murakkab. There's two types of ignorance the ulama break down. Simple ignorance is what? Brother, I don't know how my car died. I don't know how to fix it. That's simple ignorance, right? Brother, what does Islam say about the inheritance of a mother when a person dies and leaves no children? What is the rule of inheritance for this? That's simple ignorance because it formulates a question. It formulates a question without admitting any prior knowledge, right? What is compounded ignorance? What is compounded ignorance? Compounded ignorance is this. Why does Islam suppress women? That's compounded ignorance. Why is it compounded ignorance? Because you're coming with a thought or your preset knowledge. So you're not saying, does Islam suppress women? That's jahl simple. That's simple ignorance. Does Islam suppress women? You don't know, so you want to know. When you say, why does Islam suppress women? You've already taken a position that Islam suppresses women and you want to know why. You want to know why. It's like people coming and saying, why, or some question with a pre-knowledge that they just don't know about. The scholar the ignoramus who is not pleased with himself, there's a point that what does he say? What ignorance does he possess? Meaning, what ignorance does he truly possess that he cannot come out of it? If he's not pleased with himself, he can come out of ignorance because he's willing to ask, to learn. He's willing to ask and learn. And he's willing to take critiques. He's willing to take critiques. So what ignorance does he really possess in terms of what? His relationship to Allah. In his relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What ignorance does he possess? What does he possess? And what knowledge does the scholar have who is pleased with himself? What knowledge does he have? Because if he has true knowledge, as Imam Malik says, نصف العلم في كلمتين, half of knowledge is contained in two words, لا أدري. Imam Malik rahmatullah, he said half of knowledge is contained in two words, I don't know. Well, it's three words in English. I don't know. Half of knowledge is contained in that. The scholar who is pleased with himself, he's not going to say, well, I don't know. Ask someone else. He's not going to say, well, you know what, there's someone better to teach this book, this science by. Go to that person. He's not going to say, well, I don't know. No, he's going to delve into it and try to opinionize himself. He's not going to say after he answers like Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. Ahmad bin Hanbal is one of the greatest of the Mujtahid Imams. One of the greatest of them. Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullahi alayhi. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal he used to end every single answer that he answered, he used to end with, Wallahu a'lam. And Allah knows. Allahu a'lam. Allah knows. After he answered. Because of the fear that he was making a mistake. Out of fear. That's someone who's not pleased with himself. That's not someone who's pleased. And he's able to take a critique. And he's able to take challenges. Like people who come and they may have an understanding that is outside of their understanding. And so a scholar who's not pleased with himself, he welcomes it because he knows at the end of the day that they may bring something that is truthful that he may not know or that she may not know. That they may bring something that they themselves don't know. And so they see it as an opportunity to learn, not as an opportunity to not learn. So what knowledge really does a scholar possess who is pleased with himself? What knowledge does he really have? Because he's unwilling to learn even further. He's unwilling to admit weaknesses. He's unwilling to admit deficiencies, even in his knowledge that he possesses or that she possesses. And so keeping the company of someone who is not pleased with himself is better. Is better than to keep in the company of a scholar who's pleased with himself. Because one will lead to consciousness of Allah and the other one will lead to pride and arrogance. It will lead to pride and arrogance. And so one has to be cautious of not only the company that one keeps, one has to be conscious of the pathways that lead to these things. One has to be cautious of the pathways that lead to these things. And definitely being critical. Definitely being critical. I mean, people should always try to find the best company to keep. People should always find the best company to keep. And if people go and find a company of people who are sincere and who are working on themselves and working on their relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then these are the best people. Because they rub off their states, their hal, rub off. It rubs off. That's what happens. Those states of those people, they rub off on one. And so one should not blame people. Why should one sit in the company of of others who just talk as if they know everything and can't admit that they don't know something? Why? Why should you sit in the company of people like this, who just think that they know everything and want to talk about everything and want to opinionize about everything and want to speculate about everything? It's better to sit with someone who does not speak. It's better to sit with people who, when they don't know, they just stay silent. And even if they know, and they don't think that the people are ready to hear the things that they know, then they remain silent on it also. Imam Shafi rahmatullahi alayhi, he was asked a question once, one of the great mujtahid imams. We should learn the names of the great scholars of Islam instead of just learning the names of the later day scholars that are promoted in colorful books, publications through Saudi Arabia. We should learn the names of the classical scholars, and because they are the most important of the scholars, the traditional scholars, the great imams. So Imam Shafi rahmatullahi alayhi, he was once asked a question. He didn't answer. He remained silent. The person waited. He asked again. He waited. He didn't answer. So after a long period of him not answering, the person probably thought that Imam Shafi rahmatullah, and this was a great scholar, Mujtahid Imam, he probably thought that he didn't know. And so at the end he said that his silence, Imam Shafi rahmatullah, because he was asked about it, he said, I remained silent because I wanted to know whether the answer was going to benefit you or harm you. He was determining in the silence whether to answer the questioner, because he wanted to determine whether the answer would have benefited him or harmed him. Benefited him or harmed him. Today we find people, you ask any question, they jump to answer. They're first to jump to answer. And the true people are the ones who may delay in the answer because that's what they know. That's what they know. Who is it better to keep the company with? It's better to keep company with people who are silent than people who talk all the time. It's better keep the people who are silent than the people who talk all the time. That is that is one of the, because they're careful with what they say, and they're watchful of themselves, and they know that every single word that they speak, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take them to account of and with. They realize that every single word that you speak, Allah will take you to account for it. And so the more words you speak, the more account that you will have with your Lord. The more words you speak, the more accounting you will do. The more accounting you will do. And so they're careful about what? About the words that they speak. That's what they're careful of. They're careful of it. Those are the ones who are not pleased with themselves. These are the characteristics. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us, guide us, forgive us, have mercy upon us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put us on the path of truth, put us on the path of getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Help us and guide us, forgive us, help our. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve and protect our elders, our parents, give them good health and long life. Those who have passed away, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them His mercy, His maghfirah and His shade. Those who are sick, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala heal them and cure them. Those who are faced with difficulties, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for them, give them sabr, patience to deal with their difficulties. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them success in it and in their challenges. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our children, keep them on the straight path, increase them in knowledge and practice, increase us in knowledge and practice, grant us success in the akhirah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from the fitna of them, protect our women, our children from the fitna of those who are around us in our societies. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the ummah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on the ummah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have forgiveness and give forgiveness to the ummah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our homes amongst the homes of the believers. Make our last words our best words. Subhanaka alhamdik shadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Thank you for listening to the Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus. Help Seekers Hub spread the light of guidance to millions around the world by supporting us through monthly donations by going to seekershub.org/donate. Your donations are tax deductible in the US and Canada.